Right. Welcome to another video, everyone. I just did one, and I figured I'll do another one because I think some people have been messaging me, like, okay, how do you figure something out? How do you get a setup? How do you get an edge? So in this video, I'm going to go over it. Why do I have the sunglasses on? Because if you look outside, we're in beautiful Copacabana Beach in Rio, staying in the Miliano, in the Master Suite. A lot of people prefer Airbnbs. I don't know why, because, I think you just have to get a better room. You know, hotels are just like infinitely better. So let's just get right in the video. I'm winging this. I got to go in a bit. So I can't even remember what I did in the presentation. We're just going to, wing it raw, uncut. Anyways, here we go. So first, how do you get the idea? Going to go over a good example, and then going to go show like some steps of the prep work that needs to be done. And then I got some bonus things in the end. Okay. All right, here we go. First of all, this is going to be the main stock we're going to talk about. I'm going to use this as the example. So NXU, we're not looking at this being big green candle. We're going to look at the small one, the little spike, and the next day the gap down. This was back in early 2030, like I guess a while ago. I think the main point of this video is because I also had some people asking about price action trading. Like I said many times, I'm not a good price action trader. I like the ones where I know exactly what to do. I don't have to think, don't have to look at the candles, don't have to read the tape. Like, it just doesn't work for me. Some people are good at it. I'm not that good. Obviously, like, there's scenarios where you have to do it, but I try and avoid it as much as I can. So here we go. And then this is the intraday chart of this little green move. And the reason why I'm showing the intraday is because in two sides, we're going to claw back to some comments. So the big thing I want to say is if you see something one day that makes sense to you, or you think it's interesting, you have to jump onto it like right away. And this was the case on NXU. I think I had seen an S1 trade like this before. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Maybe it was Elquid. It was probably Elquid that posted about it because I know he used to do a lot of his dilution trades and post them in IU or wherever, Twitter, I don't know. But in this case, actually in IU, Investors Live, which is Nate, during the run up, he said, AMV likely gets a raise off this run. They probably need the liquidity. And then a minute later, last time, they never ended up getting it done with Maxim, probably this time though. Then the next day, got effect. Later, they did the offering, right? Just a matter of time. Remember, Maxim called me yesterday, so obviously he's expecting an offering. Then boom, they do the offering, right? So what's the main points here? Likely gets a raise off this run. Now, if we go over the next candle, you can see that was like right after the spike. He's already, mentioning that. Then the Maxim, the underwriter. I'm like, okay, what is Maxim? And then got effect. So like what's effect? And then the offering, right? So it's pretty clear. Oh, and also I think he mentioned likely round trip, right? So those are the things that I thought was interesting. Okay, like the stock went up. He was like, okay, they're going to do an offering. I think they're going to round trip. And then what happened the next morning? They do the offering, right? And here you can see the timeline of his comments and the chart pattern. It went up to 250 and then, ended up trading at 1 the next day. So like right when I saw that, I was like, okay, have to figure out what's going on here. How did he know what was going to happen? Because like if he can know what's going to happen, I have a good feeling I can get a better understanding than him if I put in the work, right? And that's what happened. So what you want to figure out is how did they raise, right? Because the end result here was the offering. How did they raise? The filings. And then, after you understand what happened, you got to get tons of examples. Now, most people can obviously say, oh, I think they're going to raise, right? And I'm going to show you my thought process, how I come at it with a different view than seeing just a stock spike that needs cash that's going to raise. Because it's easy to see that on dilution tracker these days, right? Okay, so if you look at the press release of the offering, blah, 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 the main thing here is they raised off a form S1, okay? So once I did that, I was like, okay, let's see what the timeline was. It's just like anything, like the SMCI, like knowing that there was a 99% chance they weren't going to delist back then, you want to make a timeline because SMCI had the same scenario 2 years before, or not 2 years, whatever, 10 years before, I can't remember. So some things become predictable, right? So always, I would suggest when you're trying to figure something out, do a timeline because you want to visually see everything, map everything out. It becomes much easier to understand. So if we do the timeline, you can see they did the S1 that day. S1 obviously being the registration statement for the secondary. Then they amended it on the day of the spike, got effect the following day, right? So okay, logic says, okay, they file, they amend, they spike, then they raise. Yeah. But why don't we take it one step further? Well, if you didn't know, on BAMSEC, and I think Edgar, you can see it. I don't know. I just use BAMSEC. It's easy. You can see exactly what time they do the filing, right? So 5:29. So let's actually take it a step further and let's actually map out all of these filings on the chart. So you can see they filed there the Friday, amended right after the next morning. Then they actually got effect before the spike. So you're probably wondering, I thought they got effect the day of the morning, on the morning of the offering, like, what they said in IU. Well, how come when I map it out, I see they had effect the day before? So if you don't understand how effects work, go figure that out. But this was like the big thing to me. It's like, wow, so they spiked it when they already knew that it was effective, but the public didn't see effect till after the spike. That just tells you that this offering is way more planned than you can imagine. So, the logic here is, okay, they get it ready for an offering, spike it, and then do the raise. Like I said, it's easy to say, okay, a stock's going to spike and then raise. But you want to figure out the ones where you're very confident that they're going to raise, right? Because every small cap that spikes is like low in cash. Everyone has an S3 and S1. But which are the ones that you can better predict they're going to raise, right? And for me, that was the S-1's, And when we saw this, that was like a big tell, okay? So, yeah, okay. So anyways, now let's take it another step further, right? Let's go back. What are the two things that we have that are similar? It's both S-1's, right? We have the S-1 and the amendment. So is it possible that we can start to figure out exactly in the filings what's happening? Why are they not just filing the S-1 ready in the first place? Okay? By the way, one thing I'll say actually, there's one filing which I've never seen, I don't ever see people speak about really. I think some guys like All Diligence and what's the platypus guy? Not platypus, Stomping Llama. I think they know about this as well. But you can, there's the effect thing is so interesting, and there's so much more to it than just an effectiveness, and it ties back into it being more predictable. I would put a lot of work, if no one understands filings, figure out everything you can figure out about effect, how it works, who asks for effect, when do they get effect, because there's a lot more there, and there's so many trades off of it than that, like, it's a bit mind-blowing, okay? Anyways, taking the next step further, you can see, you can use any website. I used to use CapEdge, but I saw they don't have this anymore. So you can just download both PDFs, compare PDF, whatever, online. And why don't we start reading through the filings and trying to figure out the differences? Why not file a complete S1 in the beginning? What's the point of amending? Blah, blah, blah. Here you can see it was pretty filled out, first one. But you have to scroll down. I'm just showing you a snippet. I think here's a better example. And this is a great one because this stock, here, you can see the first S1, it's blank. The second one, start filling out a lot of stuff. Obviously, this is only page one. Go and look through all the pages, because once you look at all the pages, you see everything they're adding. You start to see similarities and commonalities between all of them, and you start to understand what they're actually doing in the amendments, why they're filing blank ones, blah, 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 okay? So yeah, so here's the third one. You can see this S1, they filed this day, it had a spike the next day, but look, the S1 is blank. So I bet you can go back and see tons of people saying they're about to offer, they're going to offer. Well, they can't offer because the S1's not ready. You know what I mean? And what happened? It didn't offer for another 3 weeks. The amended 2 weeks later, then it's a more complete S1. Once again, read through it. And then this spike, this was actually a great short. I didn't short this day here because for me, it's just a small cap gapper. I don't like I said, I'm not a good price action trader. But here it's like, okay, this is the spike for an offering. And we did pretty well in this one. What else? So that's that. One other thing I'll say is these S1 offerings, they're best efforts. So understand what best efforts means. It basically means that you're allowed to short, like if you're going to play in the deal, you're allowed to short beforehand versus an over-the-wall deal on off an S3. So that's another reason why these S1s are more predictable, these spikes happen, they let the players short, easier for them to fill the book and get the offering done, okay? And obviously, the longer it takes after the spike for an offering to be done, these are all usually low floats, probably buying is going to happen, blah, 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 players might complain. At the end of the day, these underwriters and their players, they win some, lose some, but they try to keep each other happy, So another reason why it's more predictable. Okay, now looking at the actual S1 trade. Okay, how big is the offering? Well, you can read the filings. You can calculate it. For example, you can see 2 million shares at 475. So it's a $9 million offering. See if they have warrants and whatnot. And then you can pre-funded warrants approaches. I can't remember. Yeah, so here they didn't have toxic warrants. I think it was just the straight stock. The pre-funded is just so people can buy without exceeding the 5% limit. But, it's a good thing to know, like what's the float? How much can they raise? Let's imagine the stock spikes to $30, it closes at 2. Okay, so if they raise at 2, how many new shares are going to be? If like the float's going to 10x, way more toxic than if it's going to like 2x, you know what I mean? Like I said, always, at the end of the day, the more hands, the better. And there was, I'll get to it later. But here we go. So how toxic is the offering? What's the float multiple? Those are like the main things, when shorting these for me, like how confident am I that it's going to minus 90%, Now, let's get into like some bonuses now, because I think that's the main things. I couldn't log into my Notion for some reason on the laptop, but basically what you want to do once you get an idea, you get like 100 examples, go through like every example you can over the last 10 years, do the timeline thing on all of them, read all the filings on all of them. That's like what you do. Once you do that 50 times, it starts to become second nature. And then when the trade comes, then you can figure out, in my opinion, how you actually trade the stock. That's a whole separate conversation. But figuring out what happens most of the time, what happens when you're wrong, and then it becomes pretty easy to trade them, And before, this trade's died down a little bit. It's become a bit more obvious. Also, after you see some scary overnight swing trades and you lose, like once you get big enough, it becomes not as interesting. But yeah, this is a great trade, like easy to grow your account whenever, whatever. It comes pretty frequently. And also, you don't want to do this whole process. You want to do this on anything you think is interesting, because let's say like the AMC 8 thing, right? Have we had another one since? No. But doing the work on that, it helps your thinking for when something else comes, because everything rhymes. There's similar stuff coming in the future. It might not be the exact. So yeah, it's always good, to do the deep work. SGD, this was a crazy one, right? So they do the S1, okay? They amended, then they had this volume day. It doesn't look like much because the chart stretch or whatever, right? But you know how shorts are. They see a 30% spike. It's like, whoa, okay? But what's interesting is if you read the filing, the offering will terminate on November 10. So on that actual spike day, the offering was terminated. So anyone that was shorting and swinging that for an offering, well, there was no offering coming anymore. And that was a huge volume day. It doesn't look like much, obviously, because the move after. But like when a stock is a small float and it does like 10, 15x the float, and people think they're going to raise off of it, shorts stick around. And then obviously they couldn't raise because the offering was terminated. So unless they had priced it intraday, there was no offering coming, right? 3 days later, 4 days later, here comes the RW. Easily predictable, okay? Big spike. If I wasn't a retard back then, maybe could have done well. But like, these are the type of things that people usually don't, see. And like I said, I don't know everything about filings. There's probably so much more in there that's, to be discovered. But here's a really cool example of that. Another cool example. This is on Ruby. So here's where I learned as well. So thinking that none of these could raise because none of them could get effect. And then what ended up happening is Ruby ended up doing a raise. And if you read it, became effective in accordance with section 8A, blah, blah, blah. You can see it on the Cornell website. You can read it. But basically, yeah. If 20 days goes by from the last amendment or whatever, and they don't get effective or feedback, then it becomes automatic. Also, one thing I'll say, there's a lot of like lawyer interpretation of a lot of these things. So sometimes the rules get a little bit bent, what I've noticed. But yeah, you can see 20 days after the filing date is November 5th. And this is where it gets interesting. Another reason why I say these things are way more predictable than you can think. And yes, whoever's running these, the underwriter, the company, I don't know how it works. I wish I did. They know what they're doing, right? So you can see 20 days after October 16th. So here's the last S1A. Here's the spike. 1 day before they're allowed to raise, they spiked it. You can't tell me that it's not a coincidence, And I think that's it. Oh, ignore that. Let me think what else. Yeah, yeah, I kind of stopped trading these because it got to a point where like the size I want to put on becomes a little bit risky. When I do them, I usually don't hold them overnight anymore. You already get the all-day fades, and you know, I think a lot more people swing these, so it's not as interesting. But this was a really good trade while it lasted. I still do it on the ones that I really like. This Ruby I was waiting for, saw the spike, but I couldn't be bothered, and also thought they couldn't raise. Obviously they could. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.